So John, mindfulness is in the name. Obviously, it felt important enough that it needs to be part of the masthead. So when you think about mindfulness, like what does that mean to you? Why is that rise to that level of importance?
This is an illustration about how things can change and how you can grow. So I think that I'm attracted to mindfulness for the same things that made me interested in science to begin with, and later in history. It's a desire to understand the things that there are. I have this deep, unquenchable curiosity about the world, and mindfulness became part of that, and surprise to me. If you had told me 20 years ago that mindfulness practice was part of my life, much less a central part of my philosophy, I wouldn't have understood what you meant. But mindfulness practice was introduced to me actually when I was driving to and from the hospital, listening to podcasts. One of my other mentors, Sam Harris, was discussing his experiences with mindfulness training, and what he pointed out is that there's nothing to believe. It's an invitation to try some things and see if it matches your experience. And so what you're doing is you're saying, okay, anchoring yourself in the moment-to-moment changes in your body, your breath, pain, pleasure. You also are invited to notice that other things are changing all the time too. Your thoughts are flowing through. The feeling that something is pleasant or not is flowing through. Your state of mind is changing all the time, and you're invited to notice that actually that change is one of the foundational aspects of existence, of the world, of life itself. Everything's changing all the time, and because we're not directly experiencing that, it causes a great deal of suffering. Because what we try to do is hold on to things that we find to be pleasant, that we can't because they change all the time. We try to push away things that we're afraid are going to be unpleasant to us, or that are unpleasant to us, that are just changing all the time anyway. And so what we're doing is we're not understanding things as they are. And by getting the right understanding of, it's actually called the right view, by getting the right view of how things actually are, it is just naturally going to decrease suffering to some degree.
So, super interested in your thoughts about mindfulness. The topic itself is interesting to me, but the way that you think about it and articulate your thoughts on it, I think are particularly interesting. So let me bounce something off of you. So I've had some spirited conversations, probably straight up arguments with some friends about what I'm about to say. All right. So I think you could make a case that
Totally agree.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. But I think you could make a case that part of what has made us successful, this made humans successful as a species, is the fact that we are uniquely good at being anxious. And I also think that even if you don't necessarily think about it, you don't agree with that statement or even have to think about it in terms of like the species, but if you just think about individual people who are really, really good at doing stuff like identifying threats, like seeing opportunities that other people might miss, avoiding problems, pursuing opportunities, that those people tend to be more successful than other people who don't have that kind of like, almost like kind of like field of perception that's kind of always turned on,
Mm-hmm.
But the challenge, and I find this with a lot of people that I know that are like highly productive people, like when people talk about like, sometimes I can't turn my brain off, so on the one hand, there's a way to not be able to turn your brain off. It's like, that's because you're like a high octane, like always thinking about a lot, always processing a lot type of person. But you can also think about that exact same condition of life as being like a really uncomfortable, maybe even miserable way to exist. Like you can't turn your brain off. Like, you know, you're a victim of your own thoughts. You're kind of like trapped in this like echo chamber of stuff all the time. You have a really hard time just experiencing your life, being where you are at the moment that you're there, just being in touch with what's going on to you at any given moment. So anyway, what do you think about that on the one hand? Like, you know, like, do you think that anxiety, so like the difficulty in like locating yourself in your own body in the present moment, is it possible that that's actually kind of like a byproduct of what's made us as a species really successful, and or you as an individual really successful? But then also, how can mindfulness be a way for you? So if that's true, if anxiety actually has like a serviceable purpose, it's not like you want to flush it down the toilet. Like you want to be friends with it, right? But you also don't want you don't want all the bad stuff that goes along with it either. So like how, when you try to think about detaching from the anxiousness, how do you do it in a way where you still get to be a good version of yourself, but you can kind of get rid of some of the tough stuff? Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. There's a lot in there to unpack. The first thing I think is that we're talking about evolutionary psychology, and I think that's something that you had brought up in a prior discussion. I don't know if you said those words, but I'll just say it explicitly. To examine something like anxiety, we need to examine it from an evolutionary standpoint, and is it a part of what has made us successful? Well, evolution allowed us to keep it, and I think that there is very likely to be an evolutionary advantage. In fact, you can make those cases very easily. You know, being able to have that field of awareness to imagine what's around the corner without actually seeing it. You can call that anxiety. Maybe it's more just maybe to us or to caveman, it's just the way you stay alive. So that's one thing. It's evolutionarily part of the story and probably advantageous. The second thing is that with mindfulness, what we're giving ourselves the chance to do is stop identifying with it in such a close way. You can call that detachment. I think it's more just understanding things as they are, which is not that I'm not anxious. I'm not an anxious person. That's anxiety. It's an anxious moment, an anxious mood that is here now, that arose and is here now and will pass. And so to get that sort of a perspective allows you the chance to stop identifying it, stop holding it so closely, and to work with it a little bit in a way that can actually get you somewhere.
Yeah, I like that a lot because in my own experience, you know, trying to fight those kinds of feelings or those kinds of thoughts is just it's like one step further down the path that I didn't want to be on in the first place. You know what I mean? Versus and I like the way that you said it, but trying to figure out how to kind of like, I can't remember now exactly how you said it, but you know, be friends with the process, or you know. And if that, like, you know, I'm calling it an anxious response, but that kind of like thinking really hard and maybe even identifying with the thoughts, if that has had a certain level of like helpfulness, then, and I know that some of this is like, you know, internal family systems, to talk about, you know, a technical psychological term, but to identify that part of myself and even thank it for the role that it's played in helping me be successful, you know, but then to have kind of like that higher, version of myself, the kind of the resource self that sits in an authoritative position above all my parts, that can then say like, yeah, you've served me well, but right now at 11:30 at night in bed staring at the ceiling is not the time for us to go down the rabbit hole of trying to think through, you know, whatever it is that I just can't like stop thinking about. You know, you're a good part of the team, but you know, we don't need you to be out on the court playing as hard as you are right now.
I think that's it's a clever way to make a little bit light of a relationship that actually is a relationship. because that anxiety is not you. And you talked about how a person can turn it off. Well, you can't, and that's not the goal. The goal is just to see that it's going to turn itself off on its own. You haven't always been anxious.
Mm-hmm.
It started, and whatever starts is going to stop. And I think that's the key. And I think that in those moments when I'm able to remember that, and I'm not always, the more I practice, the better I get at it. But in those moments when I'm able to remember, hey, this is just something that's moving through my experience right now, whether it's an anxious moment or even a pleasant one. So to stop trying to hold on to the thing that I want to stay, and to stop pushing so hard against the thing that I don't want to be here.
Awesome.